Okay, the last influence on operations management is that of corporate social responsibility. So we'll have a look here about the difference between legal compliance and ethical responsibility, and also environmental sustainability and social responsibility. So what is corporate social responsibility? Sometimes in commerce, if you remember, you may have referred to as the triple bottom line, but from a business studies perspective, it refers to the open and accountable business actions based on respect for people, the community, and the environment. So being a responsible citizen with respect to those three key areas: people, the community, and the environment. And it involves more than just complying with the laws and regulations. It's about doing what is right by those key stakeholders I mentioned previously. It does potentially reduce profit, and it can upset shareholders, as protecting the environment and caring for society adds cost to operations. But ultimately, it's twofold: improving the reputation of a business, but also doing what is right in the eyes of the general public and in the eyes of the consumer, to ensure that the business is conducting itself in an ethical and in a responsible manner. So the question, I suppose, is why do more than just than what is legally required of you? A bit of an example or case study there, if you remember a year or two ago, the exploding Samsung phones, where they undertook a recall, and they also stopped production after multiple incidents of this device setting alight. Regulations would have prevented the phone's sale even if Samsung had continued to distribute the product. Samsung made the move to replace all the phones free of charge. The question is why, from a CSR perspective. By replacing the phone, Samsung hopes to build goodwill with its existing customers, so reputation, and ensure that future sales, despite the exploding phone damaging the company's reputation as a leading technology company. So it's an example of a business there that has been proactive. They've undertaken a mass recall, promised to replace those phones, and in an effort to build a strong relationship with the customer, ensure their goodwill is protected, and to ensure that those customers will purchase phones with them in the future. We'll look at McDonald's in class, and there's some examples of businesses there with respect to their corporate social responsibility objectives. So what's the difference between legal compliance and ethical responsibility? Ethics is more than merely complying with the law. It's about making decisions that are not only legally correct, but they're also morally correct. To show commitment to ethical behaviour, businesses will develop and generally implement and publish a code of conduct, which could or should include some of the following things. So supporting charities and local communities, so some see it as their ethical responsibility to do so. Promoting human and civil rights in Australia and overseas, and a consultation of the community prior to a significant change to the business. So if the business is going to make fundamental change to how it operates or the areas in which it operates, consulting the community to ensure that the community is on board with those significant changes. In contrast to that, legal compliance is about adherence to the law and trying to ensure and avoid having to pay penalties as a result of breaching of law. Legal compliance might include things like labour law compliance. So we've looked at the Fair Work Act, for example. A breach of the Fair Work Act relates to legal compliance. Environmental and public health compliance, so complying with Environment Protection and Biodiversity Act. Business licensing rules, so ensuring you're complying with zoning restrictions, that you're not operating a business where you shouldn't be operating in terms of zoning. Tax, ensuring the business is paying its required rate of tax. For a company, that's a 30% flat rate of tax. Adhering to the trade practices and fair market dealings. So you're not breaching Copyright Act, for example. Migration laws, intellectual property, adhering to the Corporations Act and also ASIC, so the Australian Securities Investor Commission, something we'll look at in more detail in the finance topic. And then also human rights. So the laws around human rights as opposed to just the ethical obligations that a business might have in respect to human rights. Given the main goal of business is to generate maximum profit, it's easy to see why many businesses opt for the lowest level of compliance before and therefore incurring the lowest amount of compliance, particularly for a public company who's answerable to shareholders, and shareholders want to see profit at its maximum. There is often that fine line and that balancing act between what's ethically right and what's legally required. If the legal requirement is minimal, does that business or should that business go above and beyond that minimum requirement, albeit it may well cost the business money and therefore reduce its profitability. To reduce the compliance costs, some businesses might outsource that function. Offshore outsourcing takes advantage of regulatory differences, but it could also be the expense of exploiting workers in other countries or paying them relatively low wages in those other countries. That strategy might reduce its compliance costs or its compliance requirements. The ethical conundrum is that how is that business going to be viewed by the general public in Australia, for example, or even by shareholders? And there may well be a negative backlash or reaction to that perceived exploitation or that real exploitation of workers. Apple has been accused of this over many years, with they outsource much of their manufacturing to Foxconn in China, and the conditions that those workers are working under is perceived by many to be substandard, and therefore there's an ethical conundrum. They're not doing anything illegal, they're not exploiting any loopholes, but there is an ethical dilemma about whether they should be paying those workers the wages they're paying them and having them work in the conditions in which they're working, even though for those workers, often what they're getting paid is far above what they would be getting paid at a comparable business for a Chinese manufacturer, for example. With respect to environmental sustainability and social responsibility, economic growth shouldn't occur at the expense of the environment. There needs to be a balance between the two. And being socially responsible means taking action or making decisions that are morally and ethically correct in the best interest of the community and in the best interest of the environment. Things such as noise levels, waste management, pollution need to be fully considered. And if a business isn't being socially or environmentally responsible, it may well have a hit to its reputation and to its profitability. For example, with respect to Qantas, to satisfy their consumers and increase their reputation, Qantas pilots have supported breast cancer in the past through pink epaulets on their jackets. They've had a float in the Mardi Gras to support that community. They have a large sponsorship with UNICEF. And they've got their own health surveillance program. They're attempting, as I mentioned previously, to reduce their carbon emissions through the investment of capital, be it through lighter aircraft and use of biofuels and more biodegradable products on the planes themselves. Okay, I'll stop that there.